I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. I'm the owner of a boutique effects pedal company based in Los Angeles, California. We've done many videos where we talk about best practices as it relates to your pedals and your pedal boards and how to run them optimally for the best tone. And one of our most important and most popular videos is on the subject of buffers because there is so much misinformation about them, even when they come from trusted sources. So let's go backwards and just rehash some of the basic vocabulary. So a buffer is a one-to-one amplifier in its ideal state. It is representing what comes into it on the output, but does a few things that are very important. The first thing that it does is it loads the instrument, whether that be a guitar or bass, representing the input impedance that your guitar or bass would see if you plugged into an amplifier directly so that the instrument is reacting the same way as it normally would with no pedals in use. The second thing that it does is it converts the output to a low impedance so that you are able to drive through long lines of cable and effects with having minimal changes in the sound, despite going through all of those different devices and several, let's say 10, 20, 30 or more feet of cable capacitance going back to the amplifier. The job of the buffer is to represent that sound coming in on the output, no matter what's going on in between. The next critical word that we're going to use in this discussion about buffers is impedance. And impedance, I think we should just think about as sensitivity. If something is high impedance, that means it's highly sensitive to the environment that it's in. Other devices that are in the wrong position in relativity to a high impedance device, they're going to react different no matter where it is because it's later in the chain or earlier in the chain. A high impedance device is going to be sensitive to all that. And so when we're dealing with things that are high impedance, we need to be incredibly careful about where we put them and how we use them to optimize the tone. By contrast, something that is low impedance is not sensitive to anything. It is sort of impervious no matter where it's placed and will have very little sensitivity based on the environment that it's in. There are two types of buffers that we're going to discuss and that exist in the larger framework of buffers. One is called an input buffer, and the other is called an output buffer. Now, to just quickly touch on this, these are ostensibly the exact same thing. It's just a matter of where they're used in the signal path. The input buffer is the buffer that comes first in the signal path. This is what the guitar is going to hit first before it enters the rest of the pedals on the pedal board. The job of the input buffer is to take those high impedance, we're hearing that word, that high impedance, those highly sensitive guitar pickups, and load them the same way that they would as though they were plugged into an amplifier. And this is the same for bass, loading your bass pickups the same way they would as if you were plugged into an amplifier. And from there converts it to an ultra low output impedance. This then goes through the pedals and all of the interconnections, all the cables, and is designed to keep the signal as low impedance as possible so that it is not sensitive to anything that it may be hitting subsequently as it goes from pedal 1 to pedal 2 to pedal 3, etc. The output buffer, by contrast, doesn't need to be concerned about loading guitar pickups because this buffer happens at the end of the signal path. So the guitar has already been properly loaded by the input buffer. It's gone through several pedals and interconnections, maybe exchanged buffers with some other pedals that are on the board because remember, any pedal that is on, whether it be true bypass or not, is buffering. And then of course there are buffered pedals like tube screamers or Boss pedals, etc., that are going to take over for that input buffer once it gets there. So the duty of the output buffer is not about loading the guitar pickups, but rather ensuring that no matter what changes in impedance went on the pedal board, that it's going to restore the signal back to its original strength as it drives arguably the longest cable back to your amplifier. Because typically the longest cable that we have in our signal path is the last one that goes from the output of the pedal board all the way back to your amplifier. And we want to make sure that there's integrity in that signal. And so restoring it with an output buffer at the end ensures that it's going to make it all the way back to the amp with minimal to no degradation. So do you need a buffer? This is often a question that many people ask, thinking, well, you only have a couple of pedals, let's say 3 to 5. Do you actually need to invest in a buffer? And I think that the simplest answer is yes, you do. Because even if you only have a few pedals, you're still dealing with a cable that's coming from your passive instrument into the pedal board, and that cable is very much affected by the high impedance pickups, unless you have active pickups or some sort of preamp, your instrument is seeing the full cable capacitance of whatever's leaving your instrument and going into the pedal board. Secondly, you're still seeing the output cable that's going from the very last pedal all the way back to your amplifier. As we talked about earlier, that's typically the longest cable in your entire signal path. So you still are exposed in the two longest runs that you're probably going to have in your signal path by way of the cable that comes out of your instrument to the pedal board and the one that leaves your pedal board going back to your amp. So for this reason, I do recommend still, even with smaller pedal boards, that you still use a buffer, because you still want to load the pickups from your instrument properly. You still want to make sure that your pedals are seeing a low impedance signal so they are not being hit with a signal that is sensitive to external factors such as the changing of impedances or any other factors that may occur as a consequence of all the different pedals that you might be using, and ensuring that you have a high quality buffer that's driving that long line back to your amplifier and possibly even your effects loop if you use a 4-cable or 5-cable method setup. So I think the simple answer is still yes. The bottom line is whether you have a smaller pedal board or a larger pedal board, if your absolute goal is the best possible tone that represents the guitar plugged directly into the amplifier, even though you have a bunch of pedals plugged in between them, you definitely want to have an input and an output buffer still. So how do you know if you have a good buffer? Well, there's kind of a small litmus test that you can do that I've spoken of many times before, and it's not perfect. It is a basic framework that I think will get you in the ballpark, but won't tell you everything that you need to know. That framework is you're looking for a 1 meg input impedance when you look at the spec sheet. So that'll be abbreviated by saying 1 and then a capital M and then maybe ohms after it. This is typically what you find most amplifiers to be. And when we're talking about your instrument being loaded in the same way that you would expect to see it in the wild in terms of your guitar or bass plugged into the majority of the amps, 1 meg is the standard. So we want to see that that's represented on the input impedance. On the output impedance, you want to see something reasonably 100 ohms or lower. So not 100K, 100 ohms, and possibly as low as 0, though reasonably 100 to 150 ohms is totally acceptable. Now, there's another component to this that is less talked about, which is the headroom of the buffer itself. And this is where a lot of the JFET buffers that are out there, like what you'd find in Boss and Ibanez pedals, and a lot of other buffer circuits really fall short, is that they can't take the signal from a higher voltage pedal before it. So if you have an 18 volt or a 24 volt or some combination of voltage above 9 volts that's hitting the front end of a buffer, many of them will clip because they don't have the headroom to be able to represent the power of that signal on the output. And so it ends up distorting the buffer. Now, some people might hear that as warmth or fatness potentially, but it is a color that is different than what the actual device is producing on its own. And so by that alone, I disqualify buffers like that as being quality buffers because they are unable to represent the sound of what's coming into it on the output because of the introduction of the clipping. Ordinarily, you want to look for a buffer that runs at an internal voltage that's higher than 9 volts, even if they're taking 9 volts on the input. So that could mean that they're running 12 volts rail to rail or 18 volts rail to rail or higher than that. And you do see some buffers even that don't have any internal conversion, but will allow you to run higher voltage into them, such as 18 volts or higher, in order to be able to achieve some of that headroom by way of the power supply that you're using. These are things we're going to talk about a little bit more in some of our buffer recommendations. So what are some examples of high quality buffers? Well, shameless plug, our Vertex buffer interface and buffer module, which is the same buffer just designed to fit into our pedal boards. And it has 4 of them inside of this one box. Another great one is made by our friends over at Axis Electronics, and they have several different varieties of buffers available that you can check out. I'll make sure that those are linked in the description as well for you to have a look at. John Sir makes a great buffer, and it is an individual buffer, so it can only be an input or an output buffer. And if you needed to have it as an input and output buffer, you'd need to buy multiple, but it is still a good buffer. It does offer the ability to run up to 18 volts. So you're not getting the headroom internally by way of a DC-DC converter, but you can use an external power supply in order to increase that headroom of the buffer. 29 Pedals has a input and output buffer that you can purchase separately. There's one called the Una, which is a very popular input buffer. This one is a spec in terms of the input impedance that I don't agree with, but I still think that the quality of the buffer is very high. It does have some EQs on it, which sort of in my mind disqualify it to a degree from being a true buffer. But nevertheless, with those set flat, you should have a fairly flat response. The input impedance is slightly higher, which will unload the pickups a bit, make them a little bit brighter. But I still think as far as the build quality, it is excellent at what it does, and it will convert that signal to low impedance. However, it is not in an interface unit. So you'd have to buy that unit, and then their output buffer is called the O-amp buffer, so O-A-M-P. And that similarly has some EQs and I think even a trimmer on it. And again, it falls subject to the same EQ thing that I was talking about. A buffer shouldn't have any EQs in my opinion, but it does have a very low and stable output impedance. And even though those boxes would have to be bought separately and potentially put into a different configuration than a true interface box, they still do an appropriate job. And I think that they're worth mentioning here as a version of a high quality buffer. Lastly, Mesa Boogie makes a product called the Highwire, and this was actually designed by Mario, who is the founder of Axis Electronics. And that's a great, just simple input and output buffer. It has a tuner out and a boost on it that allows you to boost, I think, the output up to maybe 10 or 15 decibels, and is a very high quality buffer as well that is readily made and commercially available through Mesa Boogie. So I can hear in the comments already, people are going to say, well, what about this buffer or what about that buffer? And they're going to be mentioning presumably either really common buffers like the Boss, the Tube Screamer, the Ibanez, the Klon is a very typical one, or they're going to be mentioning some obscure boutique companies. Now, it's totally possible that the obscure boutique company that you're thinking of makes a great buffer, and I just haven't seen it. That's absolutely possible. Although I'll tell you from experience that of the hundreds of buffer pedals and interface boxes that are out there, less than 5% of them that I've come across are actually high quality and meet the full criteria of what I would consider to be a high quality buffer. Now, that may be something that you like. You like to have more color, more warmth, but these are all elements of distortion and compression that are a consequence typically of an inefficient buffer that's not doing its job and is imparting these artifacts to your tone that weren't originally there. Now, if you like that, I'm not going to stand in your way, but my job as somebody who makes these devices and spent over a decade building rigs for some of the most prominent professionals in the industry is that we want them to have the instrument be a blank canvas. We don't want to start with color on the canvas, and we want the things that they do with their pedals, the settings on the amplifier, the way they set their guitar volume and tone knob to be the things that color the sound, not the things that are variables that are within our control and no longer variables as a consequence of high quality buffering. Why should you consider the Vertex buffer interface? Well, we are making this video, so I apologize that we're centering our recommendations around our own products, but I don't know that that should be unexpected. Again, we did give you some other recommendations of other things that are out there that I think are very high quality and I think you'd be perfectly happy with. So if you want to end the video now and go and check those out, we welcome you to do that. But I want to give ourselves an opportunity to explain to you why you might consider checking our buffer out. The first reason why is that, firstly, it has 4 buffers in it. So if you look at any of the individual buffers that we talked about earlier in our recommendations, and you break it down by the number of buffers that are available to you, ours are roughly coming in at about $62.50 a buffer because there are 4 buffers. Our device costs $249.99 at the moment that this video is shot. It also has an isolated output, so you have a transformer that can allow you to run multiple amplifiers and not have a ground loop. It also has a polarity switch so that you're able to ensure that both of your amps are in phase with the proper polarity with each other. It also maintains the specifications that we talked about. It has a 1 meg input impedance and it has an 80 ohm output impedance on all of those 4 buffers. It is running at an extremely high headroom internally by way of the DC to DC converter that we have used as part of the circuitry. So there is no context, whether it be a pro audio, line level, or mic level signal, that this would ever be clipped. It is, in essence, unclippable with any device that I have found that exists in the marketplace at this point in time. So you will never have any concern about there being distortion as a consequence of running too hot of a signal into this device. It is running at max headroom and, again, will not be clipped by any device that you throw at it. The DC input voltage range goes from 5.5 volts up to 30 volts at 150 milliamps. So it runs incredibly efficiently, and you can pretty much throw any DC voltage that would exist on a power supply at it and will still function optimally. And again, there's no benefit to running this one higher or lower. It's already regulated internally so that it's running at that maximum headroom. But again, you could throw something as low as 5.5 and something as high as 30 volts and not have any issue whatsoever. Lastly, our Vertex buffer interface can accommodate pretty much any of the most common routing signals and even a lot of the uncommon ones. It can do everything from mono to stereo to a mono or stereo audition loop, 4-cable method if you have an amp with an effects loop, 5-cable method if you have stereo amps with effects loops, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. You can run a TRS or TS foot switch through it. You can run MIDI through it via TRS. You can use a Y cable out of the input buffer and turn it into a tuner out if you want to have a tuner out as a part of your buffer interfacing system. There's literally nothing that it can't do in its current format for the majority of players. So I hope you felt like this added something to your understanding about buffers and some of the key terminology that's used when discussing buffers, what buffers are out there that might be a good fit for you, and why you might want to reconsider some of the buffers that you might currently be using if your goal is, again, the maximum transparency of tone. And hopefully you'll give ours a look. As I said before, it can pretty much cover everything that you might want to do with it, whether you're talking about a mono rig, a stereo rig, 4-cable method, 5-cable method, a mono audition loop, a stereo audition loop, wet, dry, wet. You want to run MIDI through it. You want to run an amp foot switch through it. You have impedance sensitive pedals like a fuzz face or some of these vintage pedals that may not like to see a buffer. We have a contingency even for that with a passive loop that you can enter into the buffer without having to buffer it as soon as it comes in. So then that way you're able to run your fuzzes and then hit the input buffer a little bit later after you're through with your impedance-sensitive devices. We have diagrams on our website that I'll link below that you can see all the different routing configurations that we talked about if you're interested in learning more. We also have this in-depth video if you want to check out more about all the different ways that you can route and use the Vertex buffer interface to optimize your signal path. And if you get one, you can always just scan the back of the interface unit. There's a QR code that always takes you to all of our wiring diagrams, which we're constantly updating as we get feedback from customers and learn new ways that we didn't even conceive of using it for routing different pedal options, different wiring options. So please do check that out. I'll have all the links for all the pedals that we talked about, all of the buffer interfaces that we talked about, including ours, all in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. We'll see you on the next video.